Hey guys, welcome back to another lecture of Introduction to Sociology. Today we'll be talking about economic systems. And I gotta say, this is one of the most difficult lectures of the entire course, but we'll see how it goes. So first of all, what is the economy? So a lot of people, if you ever take an economics class, they talk about supply and demand, they talk about money, they talk about prices. Well, actually, none of those really have anything to do with the economy. The economy, let me explain that actually before I go on, because maybe you'll say, wow, that isn't possible. Take a look at this bill. Right? Actually, maybe it doesn't make a lot of sense to you unless you know Arabic. So I'll show you this side, which has at least the numbers in English script. And you'll see it says Central Bank of Iraq, 25,000. That seems like a lot, right? So let's say, would you accept this, 25,000, for a car, for your house, for maybe your year's tuition? How do you know? Is it worth a house? Is it worth a car? You don't know. It just has 25,000. 25,000 what? Okay, let's try this one. Here you go. You may recognize that. That is a picture of Benjamin Franklin on a piece of paper that also holds something saying the United States of America. It says 100, and it says other stuff on it such as this note is legal tender, and give to the bearer the sum of $100. So, what is this worth? Is it worth a car, a house? You'd say, no, it's only $100, right? So maybe you could buy a cheap TV set with this, or maybe an expensive toy, or maybe a good night out at a restaurant, perhaps, okay? So, what is this really worth then? Whatever you can exchange for it, right? Okay, what about this one? Just the same. Whoops, sorry. It's got a picture of Benjamin Franklin on it, right? It says $100 in all the corners. It says this note is legal tender, and it's signed by somebody you've never heard of. And then it says over here, the United States of America. So, would you sell me your TV set for this? Yes? No? Maybe? Why not? You say, look, Dr. John, you just wrote that yourself. That's not a real $100. Okay, wait. This is a real $100, you're saying, and this is not. What's the difference? Right? This is 25,000 Iraqi dinar. What's the difference? They're all on pieces of paper. If you think about it, the composition of this is virtually the same. The artwork in these two is virtually the same, right? So why aren't they worth the same? But yet, just if this had an extra couple zeros on it, you would take it for a car, right? So what is this? Is this the economy? No, this is just money. Money is a means of exchange. Right? And of course you might say, what is this $100 ultimately worth? Well, ultimately it's worth whatever people believe it to be worth in terms of exchanging it for actual objects of value. What is really of value? Not this, because this is just a piece of paper, the same as this is. Right? But here's a clue. On the back of here it says, I owe you $100. Right? Now, would you accept that, right? Well, okay, I'm going to sign it. So it says Dr. John, right? Would you accept that and give me, let's say, a TV set in exchange for this? Okay? Now you might think to yourself, do I trust Dr. John? Right? If you trust me, why not? I'll give you $100 later for it, right? If you don't trust me, you won't accept it, and it doesn't matter if I put 1,000 on here, or 10,000, or 1,000,000, right? You still won't trust it, right? So this is the story of money. Money is about trust. You have to trust that piece of paper. When you accept this, it's like you're accepting a check, just like this, an IOU from the United States government. So whether or not you'll accept that is based on whether or not you trust the United States government is going to give you back that value. Same thing with this. Since you probably don't know what Iraq is or how much their money's worth, you probably wouldn't accept this off the bat. You would want to check it out. But once you did, you'd probably figure it had some relationship. But you see, you'd still be wrong. The point is, $100 doesn't mean anything. All right? Except what people will agree to exchange for it. Now, there are some people out here who will say, well, it all comes down to gold. Is it backed by gold? No. Gold is another medium of exchange. And in fact, gold is a very cumbersome one. You have to carry it around. Imagine having to carry around a whole brick of gold all the time in case you wanted to buy something. Or if you're going to buy a house, you have to bring 3 bricks of gold. It'd be very difficult. It's much easier to just handle bits of paper, right? The point is, do we believe in it? At the end of the day, belief in gold is no more or less than belief in money. In fact, the value of gold fluctuates much more than the value of almost any currency in the world, because the currency value is regulated by the government. Right? And when people use the gold standard, the gold value is regulated by the government. Right? So getting off the gold standard actually was a good thing for money, because it means the government can more carefully regulate it, or has more control over regulating it. So anyway, what's the point? Point is, the economy in itself has nothing to do with money. Money is only a means of exchange. So what is the economy? The economy is a system by which we produce and distribute valuable items, right? So what is that? Things, first of all, we have to eat. So things we need to eat. Then we have to have clothes, right? That's valuable. Housing is valuable. And I'm going kind of in verse order here, or actually, food most important, clothes next most important, property next most important. And as you go along, you notice that things become more valuable the less necessary they are. In fact, the most necessary thing in life is air. But we don't put a value on air because we don't have to produce it or distribute it. It's produced or distributed by nature. Water is the next most abundant thing in most places in the world, and again, usually has a very low value. So as you think about it, what the economy is really about is distributing values that are difficult to get. Those values are going to be more important because we have to put more effort into them. So nowadays we have TV sets, we have microwave ovens, we have internet, we have computer. These things were not around a couple hundred years ago. They're new systems of values which help us create other values, right? Just as eating food allows us to work and therefore create more value. So the economy is all about the production and distribution of values. Now, economic power then is how we gain power over others through this process of production and distribution, right? So again, depends on your viewpoint. If you're a functionalist, you would say, by nature, we need to have some inequality. Some people need to be in control, right? Somebody needs to direct the process, right? And there is a logic to that, right? How could you have a city or a factory without somebody in charge, without somebody giving orders, without somebody organizing it, right? Could you imagine if the workers just came in the morning and said, well, who's going to do what, right? They'd spend half the day just figuring out what they're going to do. No, it's easier if there's already a set routine. So the question is, okay, we need a hierarchy. How much power do we give that hierarchy, first of all? And secondly, are we going to give them additional benefits, right? In other words, inequality, right? So politics and economics are very closely related, because in order to have a system of order within the factory, within society, you have to also have a political system that regulates that order, right? So the economy is dealing with the actual production and distribution. The politics is dealing with who has authority and who has inequality, right? Now, in socialist governments, these are the two you've probably heard about the most, because in modern times, the big debate has been between socialism and communism. In socialism, the emphasis on creating as much equality as possible, and the government directly controls the economy. So you do not need to give some people a lot more money than others because they're given directly power by the government. On the other hand, in a capitalist economy, the government creates and enforces a system of private property and exchange. And then within that system, people operate according to the market. And what the market does is, of course, divides goods according to inequality, right? So within a market system, you must have inequality because that is the motive for pushing people to do their work. So three basic problems every society faces. What do we produce? How do we get the resources to produce? And who do we produce for, right? So who is gonna get the benefit of our production? Where is that production gonna go, right? So let's say you have a society of a village and you have to decide, okay, what are we gonna grow? Okay, we're gonna grow a variety of different foods and plants to make clothes and houses. Let's just keep it simple. Plants, food, clothes, houses. Okay, fine, right? Who's gonna do it, right? Who is going to do it? Okay, so a certain number of people are going to be working at it, then other people will be organizing it, and other people will be distributing it, right? Distributing it, right? And then where's it going to go towards? What are we going to use this for? Well, a certain amount will be eaten, a certain amount will be stored, a certain amount will be traded. You see what I mean? There's a lot of options, right? There's a lot of decisions to be made, right? And then how are we going to reward people? Are we going to give people more if they work harder? Are we going to give them more if they have a more difficult job? Are we going to give them more if they have to take more risks, right? So again, all of this is going to come down to making decisions about who gets what. It's not arbitrary. It depends on, as a society, what do we want to get, right? Now, in a market society, this is done largely by letting people do their own thing to a certain extent, right? But it depends on what they have. If they have resources, they can make decisions about how to use them. If they don't, then they just have to work for somebody else and do whatever they tell them, right? And then their rewards will come back to them according to their position of inequality in the marketplace. In a socialist or command economy, the state or a regulatory organization determines what to produce, how it's produced, how much is produced, where it's going to go, and then they can make their decisions about paying people equally. But of course, you have the question: what's the motive? What's the incentive? Are they actually going to work as hard as they could? So this is the endless debate between a market society and a demand society. Now, Karl Marx argued that in capitalism, there's an inherent contradiction, right? So what happens in capitalism is that people compete, and when they compete, some of them are going to go out of business. They get swallowed up. So what's going to happen? Over time, you get a more and more concentrated market with bigger and bigger capitalists, right? Now, when that happens, you don't have a free market anymore. It disappears because now you just have a few monopolies that control the marketplace. In other words, it's the same as the state. In other words, Marx actually said capitalism automatically becomes a form of socialism because these capitalist monopolies, in fact, are socialist. They've socialized the means of production by absorbing everything, right? Think about the oil sector, right? There's a few companies that control almost all the oil. The healthcare sector, right? So Marx said the solution is get rid of the capitalists. The state will take it over and we'll run it, for the people's benefit. Okay. Now Weber, however, argued that when the government takes over these organizations, it isn't actually fundamentally changing anything. In fact, it's only substituting political power for market power, right? So it doesn't necessarily give power back to the people. This is why Weber was a bit of a pessimist. He didn't think there was really a solution. And of course, functionalists tend to argue that as long as we maintain a balance between representative government and market forces, in other words, what they call pluralism, we have a government, we have a market system, and as long as they have more or less equal powers, this will maintain a balance, and hopefully you'll have a balance of inequality and a balance of production, right? But is that really possible? How do we control the potential towards monopolization? How do we manage the levels of inequality in society? So one obvious difference is how they distribute income. In a market economy, you cannot distribute income equally, right? Because the whole basis of a market is that people have different amounts of money to spend, and therefore some people will be forced out of the market. They will not be able to buy the goods. So you ration goods according to what people can afford. If you can't afford butter, you buy margarine. If you can't afford margarine, you buy Crisco oil. You can't afford that, you do something else, right? Now, government can try to alleviate some need, but if government tries to create equality in a market economy, at least in theory, the argument is that it disrupts competition. So, for example, why should I work at a job if I can get the same amount of money sitting around on welfare, right? Now, you might ask yourself that. Now, some societies actually provide quite a lot of welfare, like Sweden and Norway, but people still prefer to work. So you might argue there are cultural reasons for that. It isn't just about money, right? But in the other side of things, free market depends upon demand, usually immediate demand rather than long-term needs, because you make a profit based on what you sell today. Right? You don't make a profit unless you sell something today. In the long term, you're taking a risk. So the long term is always less invested in than short term. And this also means that market systems don't necessarily solve problems until it becomes profitable to solve the problem. So for example, global warming. Fact is, we've known about global warming as a society for 20 or 30 years. Right? This is not a debate. This is a known fact. Right? The globe is warming up and it will have devastating effects. But it's not profitable to do anything about it yet because the problem hasn't happened yet. Right? When the problem happens, then it will be profitable to do something about it. But the question is, will that be too late? Will it be too late? We'll be solving the problem while we're dying? Perhaps. Another benefit of market economies is that competition is very efficient in the short run. It gives people different options. It inspires innovation because you can always come up with something new. But again, going back to Marx, every competition has a winner, and that then has the tendency to concentrate wealth more and more. Think about this. You think about some of the people who have created innovative technology. These are the people who go to the top, right? So in the late 1800s, it was the railroad barons. Then in the early 1900s, it was the automobile companies, right? So whoever was the leading edge of technology, right? In the 1960s, it was the high tech companies, right? IBM and other things, right? And in the 1980s, it was the computer companies. Right? Then the Mac and the other things like that. And then it was the software companies, right? And now it's not even them. It's the image companies like Facebook, right? Who's the richest company in the world? Before it was Bill Gates who made Microsoft, Now it's this guy who made Facebook, right? And then you'll have in 5 or 10 years another technology that will take off. And suddenly you'll have some 15-year-old, maybe one of you, who will be a multi-trillionaire and own half the planet, right? Now, another issue with market economies is what we call crisis of overproduction, right? The argument is that in capitalism, because capitalists are constantly competing with each other, they're always trying to produce more and better, right? Which is good in a way, but the problem is eventually they outstrip the marketplace. They outstrip demand. And at that point, you have all this production going on, and of course at the same time they're trying to lower costs. So the only real way of lowering costs is to lower the cost of labor, because that's where most costs come from, right? So if you're paying workers less and yet you're producing more, that means there's less demand and there's more supply. And when that happens, eventually you reach a crisis of overproduction. You have more supply than can be demanded, and it's like any situation. What if you've got 100 pairs of shoes and only one person? He doesn't need 100 shoes, unless, of course, it's I won't say it because I'll get in trouble. Anyway, most people don't need 100 pairs of shoes, so they won't buy them all. So what's happening? The shoe sellers are trying to sell their shoe. They're going to go down, down, down in price until the price of the shoe doesn't pay for production, and everybody goes out of business. So that is the origin of depressions. That's why capitalist societies go through a regular recession every 10 or 15 years. It's a normal part of the cycle. Now, command economies try to deal with this by distributing income more equally. Right? So say, okay, everybody's going to get the same amount of money, or more or less the same amount of money. Right? But this is a problem. Instead of market incentives, so I'm going to make more or a better product in order to make more money. That's the incentive under capitalism. Under communism or a command economy, it's a political incentive. You'll be, oh, you'll get a raise or you'll get a better job if you meet your quota. And there's a problem. It's being decided by a committee, and, you know, with all due respect, committees generally don't do very good jobs, and they're going to more or less look at, did you meet your quota or not? So all the emphasis is on the quota, right? So every organization is going to work as hard as they can to meet that quota and spend whatever resources they need to spend to reach that quota, and then they're going to stop, right? So you never get too much, right? That's one feature of a command economy. You never get too much. It solves the problem of overproduction right there. Right? But on the other hand, do you reach that target, and how many resources do you use? Right? These resources have no, cost, because everything's being focused on the quota. So it uses vast amount of resources. It doesn't matter what resources you use, or you might just say it's very, very inefficient in its use of resources, including labor. So for a number of different reasons, the problem of command economies is not overproduction, but underproduction, right? The other thing is that needs are defined by committees. I mean, it's all very fine, but again, committees are not the best way to decide what the need of a population is, right? It's maybe better to ask the population. Now, of course, in a capitalist economy, you don't have a perfect system either, because when you talk about the market, it's not about people, it's about money. So you're saying what the people need is not the same as what the market wants, right? Need and demand are two different things in a capitalist economy. But anyway, we don't need to get too much into that kind of thing. So the problem is that you have similar types of problems, except kind of in reverse. Capitalism tends to overproduce, communism or command economies tends to underproduce. Capitalism over, communism under, and both of them end up creating recessions or periods of crisis, which can be overcome but needs work, right? Generally, the solution in capitalist economies has been to insert some aspects of a command economy, such as redistributing income. Because when you take money away from the rich and you give it to the poor, then the poor can afford to buy the products again, right? So that somewhat resolves the problem of overproduction, gets the system going again, right? In a command economy also, you give people some freedom to produce their own goods on the side. Suddenly they will be free, they will be working, and they will produce goods that people need. So in reality, most economies are mixed economies. The United States, for example, is not entirely capitalistic. A lot of goods can only be produced by the government. That's why the government's there. Only the government can produce law and order. Right? By its very definition, government is the organization that creates and produces law and order. And by that token, government must be there before anything else. Right? Other things government is better at doing, for example, roads or creating social goods, such as defense, right? What if we had to pay different companies for defense? Okay, which company do you want to have defending your country? Everybody's going to decide individually, right? And how do we know whether or not they're doing a good job, right? When we go to war, we're going to have to all pay up all. It'd be ridiculous. Right? Absurd. Just the idea that the private sector could take over defense of the country is absurd. But in some way, they're already doing it because corporations are now controlling the technology of our defense sectors. Then you have policing, you have highways, you have parks, you have the question of education. Should education be public or private? Right? Some people would say private, therefore parents would have an incentive to spend more time with their children or whatever. But what's going to happen if half your population doesn't get educated? Right? Is that going to be better for the rest of us? Health, general welfare? And remember, when it comes down to this, right? This doesn't mean anything without the power of the nation behind it. Right? So if half of Americans are illiterate, this is worth nothing, or less, let's say, right? So the question is, ultimately, an economy is not just about the economy, it's about the entire social structure. So every economy must be a mixed economy. The question is whether there's more emphasis on the collective side or more emphasis on the individualistic side. So democratic socialism, for example, many European countries would be described as democratic socialist, which means they follow some socialistic principles. Generally, they're capitalist economies with a strong private sector, but they have strong state intervention. So generally, that means certain sectors, such as the health sector, the educational sector, these sectors are strongly supported through the state or fully funded by the state in order to guarantee access. And you think about it, it doesn't make the capitalist part weaker, it may make it stronger. So for example, universal education on a meritocratic system, for example, is better for businesses because then you get educated employees, like in Germany or Sweden or Norway. The companies know they're going to get highly educated employees, they can pick from the best, and then they don't have to spend a huge amount of money on training. Right? By the same token, if they have a universal health care, every company knows their employees' needs will be taken care of. They don't have to worry about going around buying up private insurance. The amount they spend in taxes on health care is a lot less than companies in the U.S. spend through the private sector plus taxes. Right? So in fact, they end up saving money over the U.S. system, right? So in that way, there's we might say a partnership, and in Europe there's always been a partnership. As we talked about earlier in the section on American exceptionalism, in America we've always distrusted that kind of a partnership between government and industry. So overall in Europe, social indicators are higher, quality of life indicators are higher, taxes are higher, but expenses for basic needs are lower, so people can spend less money taking care of their basic needs. So it all depends on what people want. On the other hand, perhaps people would say in America we have more freedom, we have more choices about how to spend our money ourselves. So again, it comes back to what a culture, to a certain extent, what a culture wants for itself. From command to market. So, of course, as you probably know from your history classes, command economies were set up in the most socialist revolutions or communist revolutions from the early part of the 20th century, 1917 in Russia, and later in China, in Cuba, North Korea. Eastern Europe was incorporated into this system after World War II. So, but what's happened is that many of them have failed, essentially. They've reverted back to market economies. And a lot of it goes back to some of the contradictions of socialism. It was simply underproducing. It could not compete with the production levels of capitalism. And again, in reality, that's not really a critique of socialism, because the whole idea of socialism is it's supposed to value things other than the economy. People are not supposed to have to work so hard. So the idea that people didn't work so hard under socialism is they would say, or Karl Marx would say, well, that's the point. Why do we need all this progress? Why do we need all this new technology, which just makes us all run around in circles and work even harder, right? Well, for better or worse, people would say it failed. It could not compete with the capitalist economies. Could be because the economy, the plans were too rigid, lack of flexibility, lack of motivation. But one of the results has been that many of these countries have kind of gone back to where they were originally before they became socialistic, which is in becoming kind of second-tier countries. In other words, they haven't necessarily exploded in productivity since then, because frankly, most of them were less productive to begin with for many different reasons, and many have resorted back to going back to dictatorships and oligarchies. So in America, we focus on what we call the welfare state. So we have the overall government, democratic government system. You have a capitalist system in the economy. In order to balance these two, because if there's too much inequality, well, it's a democracy. So people are going to vote to say, hold it, we need to control this level of inequality, right? There are always going to be more poor people than rich people. So you need to placate at least the poor people. So they've created this thing called the welfare state. So basically, different arguments for creating the welfare state are behaviorists. You blame, basically you say these people are lazy or they need to change their culture. So we don't want to give them too much money, just enough to survive, right? In fact, many of these people who have this belief would prefer to take away welfare altogether. And this would include most libertarians, many Republicans, who believe that welfare simply encourages people to not work, right? Then you have a residualist argument. This basically says some poverty is always going to exist in society. Now, most functionalists would probably agree with this. They would say you need a certain level of poverty in society because we have a market system. So therefore, it's useful to have a welfare system in order to take care of those people at the bottom, right? Social insurance. The social insurance is higher on the level between functionalism and lower level conflict theory. It basically says that, okay, some poverty is okay, but we want to make sure people don't become too impoverished. So you should not have large pools of poverty, large pools of inequality, because this is going to create social problems like disease and things like that, and maybe revolution, right? And then finally you have the egalitarian populace. So this is typically the more Marxist or left-wing conflict theorists who argue that people have a right not to be in poverty, that we should take care of the basic needs of all people in society, because if they can't work, why should we be judging them? Or if they can't earn a lot of money, Why should we be judging them? So these are very different philosophies about how social welfare should work. In the United States, we tend to focus more towards the behavioralist or residualist point of view. In Europe, they focus a bit more towards the social insurance and the egalitarian point of view. Which works better? Well, it depends. It's going to depend partly on the culture, partly on the society, and ultimately, partly, perhaps according to conflict theorists, what system gets imposed on us. Right? Think about, though, the difference between welfare, social security, and welfare. Welfare. So when we talk about welfare, they talk about benefits for the poor. These are always being criticized, you'll notice. Right? The debate is always about welfare. On the other hand, Social Security, that's somebody everybody pays into, and it's called security. It's called an insurance program. So when you get old, you'll receive a pension that you've paid into. So people don't think of this as welfare. They think of it as something that they have earned, they have paid into, right? Which is in a way true, but in a way no, because it's like anything else. You pay taxes, and you're going to get back what you get back, right? As we'll be talking about later, when the baby boom generation gets old and more of them start to retire, you may find out there is no more Social Security. And all that money you've been putting in over the years is going to disappear maybe, right? But yet people think of Social Security as a right. On the other hand, welfare, this is the money we give to corporations. Billions and billions, trillions of dollars. We spend $500 billion bailing out the banks after they all went after bad loans, right? And we do it again and again and again. Every 8-9 years, we spend trillions of dollars to bail out huge corporations, right? And see, we call this welfare, and at the end of the day, nobody questions it. Nobody argues against it, because if we don't have the corporations, they're not going to create the jobs, and then nobody will have any employment. Right? So as Marx says, in capitalism, we have to give the capitalists first what they want before we as workers can get what we want. Right? In capitalism. So thank you very much. Hope you enjoyed the lecture, and check the companion for review and assignments before moving on. All right, have a good day.